On a frozen February morning in 1542, the air inside the Tower of London was thick with the smell of damp stone and the quiet terror of a girl who had once been the most powerful woman in England. Katherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was not a seasoned politician or a religious revolutionary. She was a teenager who had spent the previous night practicing a move no one should ever have to learn: how to lay your head on a wooden block so the axe would hit its mark cleanly the first time. As she stepped onto the wooden platform, she was so weak from fear that guards had to support her. Within minutes, the rose without a thorn was dead. Her body was carted away to a nameless grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to her cousin, Anne Boleyn. For centuries, history has remembered her as the wanton queen, a flighty, boy-mad girl who cheated on a king and paid the ultimate price. But as the analysis will show, her story is not a romance or a scandal. It is a crime scene where the victim was blamed for the negligence of the adults who were supposed to protect her. To understand Katherine Howard, one must first accept a surprising twist that reframes everything commonly taught about her life. Traditional history paints her as a predator who used her beauty to seduce an aging king. But modern research into primary documents shows that Katherine was actually a victim of repeated sexual grooming and abuse. The scandals that led to her death did not start at the royal court. They began when she was a 12-year-old child, living in a dormitory crowded with older men and neglected by her family. This realization shifts the story from a simple tale of infidelity to a complex case study of how the Tudor legal system was rewritten to kill a teenager who had become an embarrassment to the crown. Why did the men around her, including her own father and uncle, treat her like a piece of property to be traded for power? And what were the hidden stakes for the Howard family as they pushed a traumatized girl into the bed of a king 30 years her senior? This video will build out the heart of the story. It will uncover the specific details of her music lessons with Henry Mannix and her marriage to Frances Durham, relationships that were later weaponized to destroy her. The consequences of this story go beyond one girl's execution. They reveal a pattern of behaviour in the Tudor court. The survival of the dynasty was more important than the safety of its children. Katherine Howard was born into a family with a legendary name, but a very empty purse. Her grandfather, the second Duke of Norfolk, had been a hero at the Battle of Flodden Field, but the wealth of the family followed the rules of claim, meaning only the eldest son would inherit the fortune. The exact date of Catherine's birth is uncertain, as records for younger children of minor nobles were rarely kept. Most historians estimate she was born between 1518 and 1524, with 1523 or 1524 as the most likely. When her mother died around 1528, Catherine's world became even more unstable. Her father, unable or unwilling to raise his many children, sent Katherine to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess kept large households at Chesworth House in Horsham and Norfolk House in Lambeth. While this sounds grand, the reality for the young girls there was much different. The Duchess was often at court or busy with her own affairs, leaving the teenage girls in her care to be raised by servants and older girls. These older girls were often bored and looking for trouble. Catherine's education was typical for a noblewoman: reading, writing and music, but it was not as rigorous as that of others. This lack of guidance left her vulnerable to the predatory men who lived and worked in the house. The heart of this tragedy began in the dormitory at Lambeth. The Duchess of Norfolk ran her home like a finishing school for daughters of minor nobility. However, witness statements describe a dormitory setting that was loud, crowded and unsupervised at night. It was here that Katherine was targeted by two men. These men would later cause her death. The first instance of abuse occurred when Katherine was about 12 or 13. Henry Mannix, a music teacher hired to teach her the lute and virginal, began a relationship now identified as grooming. Mannix was a grown man, Katherine was barely a teenager, but he used flattering and fair persuasions to convince her to allow him to touch her inappropriately. Mannix later boasted to other servants about his dishonest intentions, a term that in Tudor times meant unchaste or sexual. When the Duchess eventually found the two of them embracing, she struck Katherine but did not punish Mannix or remove him from the girl's presence. This failure by the Duchess to protect Katherine's honour established a pattern in which Katherine realised she was on her own in navigating men's desires. Shortly after the situation with Mannix, Katherine was pursued by Francis Durham, a secretary in the Duchess's household. This relationship was more intense and certainly physical. The two of them began referring to each other as husband and wife, which carried significant legal weight in the 16th century. In the Tudor era, a verbal promise to marry followed by sexual intercourse was often considered a legal binding pre-contract. Durham would visit Katherine's room late at night, bringing snacks like wine, strawberries and apples. Her roommates later testified there was much panting and puffing in the shared bedroom, and the two were constantly hanging together by the belly like sparrows. Katherine later claimed she only gave in to Durham because of his subtle persuasions and her own ignorance and frailness. But when the Duchess discovered this relationship, she was furious, not because Katherine had been taken advantage of, but because sexual history made her less valuable as a political bride. Durham was sent away to Ireland. Katherine was eventually moved toward the royal court, where her family hoped she would catch a much bigger prize, the king himself. By 1540, King Henry VIII was a man in crisis. His marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a disaster. He famously claimed he could not do his duty with her because he found her unattractive. The Duke of Norfolk saw the king's unhappiness as a chance to promote his own family, and he secured Katherine a position as lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, placing her in the king's path. Henry VIII, nearly 50 years old and suffering from a painful leg ulcer, was instantly captivated by the teenage Katherine. To the aging king, Katherine represented a return to youth. She was lively and beautiful, and she appeared pure and innocent. He began to give her gifts, showing his serious intentions. Henry's infatuation was so strong that he moved quickly. His marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on July 9, 1540. 19 days later, he married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. On the same day, he had Thomas Cromwell, his former right-hand man, executed as a stark reminder of how quickly favour could turn to death in the Tudor court. Historians have long claimed that Henry called Katherine his rose without a thorn, a phrase now inseparable from her memory. But analysis reveals this may be a misattribution. The Latin motto, shining rose without a thorn, was used on gold coins early in Henry's reign, long before he met Katherine. The phrase likely referred to the king as the perfect Tudor rose or to the Virgin Mary. Regardless of the nickname, Henry treated Katherine like a delicate treasure. He called her a jewel of womanhood and believed he had finally found a woman who was simple, loving, and most importantly, chaste. For Katherine, marriage was not a romantic choice, it was a command from her family she could not refuse. She was a teenager, married to a man who was obese, often in pain, and had already executed one wife and abandoned 3 others. Catherine Howard's reign lasted only 18 months, but she was more active than many history books suggest. She was not merely a ditz or a plaything. She used her position to help others navigate the court's complex social rituals. Katherine was known for her kindness to her servants and her generosity to those in need. When she heard that Margaret Pole, the elderly Countess of Salisbury, was freezing in the Tower of London without any warm clothes, Katherine sent her own dressmakers to provide for her. She also played a role in bringing the king's children back into his favour. She treated the young Princess Elizabeth with respect, giving her gifts and a prominent place at the table, a kindness that the 8-year-old girl would never forget. Catherine's relationship with Anne of Cleves was particularly interesting. Instead of seeing her as a rival, Katherine treated Anne as the king's beloved sister. They often danced together, and Katherine even re-gifted jewellery and dogs to Anne, participating in their friendly competition or gift-giving that was common among noble women. Yet despite her success as a social queen, Katherine's personal life was spiralling into danger. In the spring of 1541, she began secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber and a distant cousin. Culpeper was a favourite of the king, but he had a reputation as a lecherous man and a known sexual assailant. The meetings were arranged by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who would let Culpeper into the Queen's rooms late at night. While Katherine and Culpeper both later denied having full sexual intercourse, they admitted to heinous purposes and secret meetings during the King's Road progress to the north. Katherine wrote Culpeper a letter that would eventually sign her death warrant. "I never long so much for a thing as I do to see you. Yours, as long as life endures." Historians often ask why Katherine would risk her life for Culpeper. Some suggest it was a genuine teenage crush, while others believe she was being blackmailed or pressured by a man who had the king's ear. In the high-pressure environment of the Tudor court, where the king's health was failing, Katherine may have been seeking an ally for the future, unaware she was walking into a trap. The end began on November the 1st, 1541. While Henry VIII was celebrating the Feast of All Saints, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer left a letter on the King's seat in the Royal Chapel at Hampton Court. The letter detailed the accusations made by Mary Lascelles about Katherine's sexual history with Henry Manox and Francis Durham. Henry's first reaction was one of pure shock and disbelief. He refused to believe his rose could be anything other than perfect. However, he ordered a secret investigation to clear her name, but unfortunately, the investigation did the opposite. The council members tracked down Manox and Durham. Manox admitted to handling her when she was a child, and Durham confessed to a full sexual relationship. Worse yet, they found that Katherine had hired Durham as her personal secretary once she became queen, a move that made it look like she intended to continue their affair. When they eventually discovered the letter to Thomas Culpeper, the case against her shifted from unchaste past to current treason. Archbishop Cranmer was dispatched to Hampton Court to interview Katherine. He found her in a state of absolute frenzy and hysteria. She was so distraught that Cranmer reported that she was in such lamentation and heaviness she would lapse into uncontrollable sobbing, making it impossible for him to question her at first. Cranmer, perhaps feeling some pity for the girl, tried to help her craft a confession that might save her life. He suggested that if she admitted to a pre-contract with Durham, the marriage to the king would be invalid and she might be sent to a nunnery instead of the scaffold. But Katherine, perhaps confused or trying to be honest, denied the pre-contract and instead claimed Durham had forced himself upon her. By refusing the legal out of the pre-contract, she left the king with no choice but to treat her as a queen who had committed adultery. In a modern legal system, a person is tried for a crime that exists at the time of the act, but in Henry VIII's England, the king simply changed the law to fit the crime. Katherine had not technically committed high treason by having a relationship with Durham before she met the king, but to solve the legal problem, Henry had Parliament pass a bill of attainder. This allowed the king to declare her guilty and sentence her to death without a trial. He also passed a new law, the Royal Assent by Commission Act of 1541, which made it treason for any woman who was not a virgin to marry the king without telling him. This was a retroactive law. It made Katherine's past behaviour a capital crime after she had already done it. Most civilised societies today forbid such laws, but Henry was determined to punish the girl who had humiliated him. On February the 10th, 1542, Katherine was taken by barge to the Tower of London, passing under the heads of Durham and Culpeper, which were already spiked on London Bridge. shift in Katherine's story occurs when we stop seeing her as a villain and begin to see her as a symptom of a broken system. For centuries, Katherine was dismissed as an ignorant teenager or a sex-obsessed harlot, but this narrative was largely created by the men who killed her to protect the king's ego and the Howard family's political standing. Modern historians looking through a feminist and mental health lens see a child who was abandoned by her father and uncle and left in a predatory environment. The relationship with Henry Mannix was not a flirtation, it was sexual abuse. The relationship with Frances Durham was not a choice, it was the result of a girl having no other resources or guidance. When she arrived at court, she was essentially trafficked into the king's bed to satisfy his carnal appetite. Her inability to produce a son and her past relationships were used to justify her murder. The tragedy is not that Catherine Howard was unfaithful, tragedy is that she was never given the chance to be anything other than a political pawn. Catherine Howard died at approximately 18 or 19 years of age. Her reign was brief, a bright spark that was extinguished by the very men who had ignited it. She left no children, no major political changes, and very few authenticated portraits. Most were likely destroyed after her execution to erase her from history. However, her legacy survives in a way we now understand the Tudor court. She was the rose that the king crushed when he realised she had a past that he couldn't control. Her story serves as a stark reminder of the cost of power and the vulnerability of youth in a world that valued women only for their purity, their ability to provide heirs.